Hi, I'm so happy today. We have Mischa Wilmers here with us, and he is from I Am Learning a Mandarin podcast. And it has been such a pleasure meeting him and talk with him, and amazed by his learning experience. That he has been learning Mandarin for 8 years, and then he actually is the host of the podcast I'm Learning Mandarin. And he focused on pronunciation of Mandarin Chinese. A lot of people are very interested in that. And the most important thing is like on the journey, he actually started the Mandarin Retreat. We'll talk about that. It's like a summer camp. It sounds so much fun. And then we definitely would like to. I'm very curious about that. I believe you are too. And then let's just jump right in. Hi, welcome, Misha.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be
And
here.
oh, wonderful. And Misha, I know you're Chinese and Mi Kai. Well, that's a really that name actually matches with your English name. And then where did you get that name?
So it was basically my first Chinese teacher. He gave me that name. I guess it was just because he thought it sounded slightly like my real name, which is Misha. So
Mhm.
I guess that's the story behind that. I've gone through like periods where I've changed names a few times, but I've always kind of gone back to the original one. I've kind of
Mm.
been called that in Chinese for too long, so it's kind of part of my identity now, even though like I feel like it's not, I've never met like a Chinese person with that name, but yeah.
That's I think so, Misha and Mikai. And well, you've been learning Chinese for right now, about 8 years now, and you started a podcast. When did you start your podcast?
The podcast was started, I think, in about 2020. It was sort of in the middle of the pandemic lockdown. It was
Mm,
shortly
mhm,
after I started the I'm Learning Mandarin blog. Because
mm.
initially I started the blog where I was just writing about my experiences in the thick of it, like sort of learning Chinese. I'd been learning Chinese for about 2 or 3 years by then. So I started writing about some of the difficulties I was having, what I was doing to overcome them. And
Mhm.
then just from that, line, I started interviewing other people and started a podcast where I published those interviews with other Chinese learners about how they were doing things and interviewing kind of interesting voices within the Chinese learning community. So that was about 2020, I think.
Yeah, so you started a blog first and then you started a podcast. And so basically it sounds like it is like a documentary. It's like documenting your own experience for learning Mandarin. And then the most important things I noticed that because you're doing all this through self-study and then you are actually living in UK. So this is something very interesting what you're sharing, your journey. And so what inspired you to start learning Mandarin Chinese?
Oh, to start learning Mandarin. Well, I was like sort of I moved to a new city in near kind of where I'm from, which is Manchester, but the new city I'd moved to was Leeds, which is about an hour's drive away. I didn't really know anyone there. And so I was just looking for hobbies, anything to do to kind of do in my spare time and meet people and that kind of thing. And so I noticed that the university that I was working for, they were offering cheap Mandarin evening classes, just sort of for staff members because I was working at the university. And so I just signed up on a whim with a friend, and we went together. And the first class, sort of, the Chinese teacher, really enthusiastic, very charismatic. He would just like throw loads of Chinese words and sentences at us and get us to repeat them. And I found the process quite thrilling, so I kind of stuck with it. But that was my first taste of it. I didn't really have a good reason to get involved in Mandarin learning at the beginning. I knew I was kind of interested in languages from school. Like I'd studied French, and growing up, I was raised bilingual in English and Spanish because my mum's Spanish.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I hadn't really, since doing French at school, I hadn't really had done much foreign language learning, but I just thought kind of it sounded like something fun, so I just like decided to have a go.
Yes. And from there, and you continued until now.
Hmm.
Have you been to any Chinese speaking places to learn more Chinese? And how do you, I know mostly you're doing a lot of things on self-study, but do you have any overseas learning experience that you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, I guess my first experience was about a year into learning. So the evening classes I was doing with Confucius Institute, and they had a trip that they organized for anybody who was doing their evening classes. And this was a trip to Beijing
Hmm.
and also Xi'an. And so I went on that trip, and that was kind of my first experience of being in a Chinese speaking country. And so at that time, I really didn't speak any Chinese. It wasn't that beneficial for my Chinese learning because I didn't really understand anything that was going on around me. But it was an interesting cultural experience, and
Hmm.
it lasted about 2 weeks. So then after that, like about a year later, this is about 2 years into my learning journey, then I got to go to Taiwan. I was invited there to visit a friend who'd been my language exchange partner in Leeds, and he was from Taiwan. So I went to visit him and then went traveling around Taiwan myself as well. And by that time, like I said, I'd been learning for 2 years, so that was my second experience of learning Chinese in a Chinese speaking country. I wasn't doing classes or anything there, but it was just more I wanted to take advantage of being immersed in the language and see how much I could pick up. And after that was about 2 weeks as well. And after that experience, I found that like after 2 years of learning, like I really hadn't learned very much Chinese at all. Like the evening classes I'd gone to and the methods that I was using in the UK, I thought I'd been working really hard, but I wasn't able to understand anything that was going on around me. I was thinking 2 years in, like surely by now I should be able to do something a bit more with the language at this point. So that
Mm.
kind of second trip to kind of Chinese speaking part of the world was what became a kind of catalyst for me to look more seriously into the question of like how are we supposed to go about learning languages different from English as
Right.
Mandarin Chinese as adults. And so I started researching that a bit more, and then that period then sort of coincided with the lockdown period. So I
Mm.
started spending more time on all these things. And then during that period, I didn't have any opportunity to go to Chinese to travel at all, basically.
Wow.
Um, and then my third and final experience of traveling abroad and learning Chinese abroad was I went to Taiwan. I basically took a 6 month sabbatical off my work, and I was able to go to Taiwan to study at National Taiwan University on an advanced Chinese course for a year, and that was in 2023.
Mhm.
Um, so I, so yeah, so I was there for a year, and then I went back to the UK, but that was just for a semester, and the rest of the year I was traveling and working on my own projects.
Right.
I should say that was a year. So like when the 6 months was over, I ended up actually quitting my job and decided to like work on Mandarin learning projects full time, which is kind of you've alluded to a couple of them, like the Mandarin Retreats and my coaching business.
Right. And that sounds very exciting because from self-studying to China to Taiwan and then lockdown and really think about how to accelerate the learning in a way
Mm,
that probably focus more on communication. That's what I heard. And also then go back to Taiwan and do more studying and then also working on your project. Very interesting. So if you compare this, from what you learned it before for 2 years and you felt like, well, there was something lacking to you went to Taiwan and then kind of really trigger something, say, well, I want to make a change so I can probably
mm,
communicate better at work on my proficiency. I think a lot of learners all probably been through this period, or they are in this
right, right.
possibly. So what is the challenge you have faced and then major challenges you encountered? And can you share that with us?
Yeah, the first challenge I had when I went to Taiwan, the thing that really was the catalyst for me was that I didn't understand any of the language that was going on around me. So
Mm,
whenever I was in the most simple situations, trying to buy a train ticket, or when the conversation with my friend went beyond just real basics, I would be completely lost and
mm,
I wouldn't know how to handle that. So I would say something, and invariably that whatever came back, I wouldn't understand it. And so that was the first thing that I decided I needed to address when I got
mm,
back to the UK. And
mm,
that's where I kind of discovered this principle of comprehensible input, which listeners may or may not be familiar with, but it's this idea from the linguist Stephen Krashen that the main thing you need when learning a language is input material. You need to read and listen to material that's appropriate to your level,
mm,
or which means that it's I plus one is the term that's used, that it's just slightly above what's easy for you. So like
mm,
if you take something that you could understand 100%, then you're unlikely to learn very much from consuming that. But if
mm,
you take something that's just kind of out of reach, like between 1 and 5% that you don't understand. And that's kind of ideal, and you'll end up like internalizing a lot of the language that way, and your comprehension skills will get better and better. And as I said before, so that coincided, my kind of discovery of that concept coincided with the lockdown. And so I started kind of just um, reading and listening to as much Mandarin appropriate to my level, which at that time was quite a low level. So maybe approaching lower intermediate, but really mostly elementary. And so I
Mm.
just got my hands on any graded readers that I could, any kind of low level podcast that I could with transcripts. And I spent a lot of the lockdown when I wasn't working, just like immersing myself in Chinese because there wasn't much else to do. So it was a perfect opportunity to do that. And this was the first time when I found in my language learning up until that point that my Mandarin was actually really progressing. So
Mhm.
this was like the first time I felt I'd found a method that really worked. And then there's more to the story than that because like going on from that, I found that like although it was effective, it worked. My comprehension skills got better and better. I reached a point where I realized that my speaking skills needed some work. So if I was to like um, overcome the kind of speaking barrier, then I would need more than just immersing myself in comprehensible input. And that's where I got more into a lot of the things that I've blogged about since, which are about how to improve your speaking abilities and pronunciation in the Mandarin language. That was
Mhm.
the kind of the second obstacle and challenge that I faced after coming back from Taiwan.
Wow. So basically, we're talking about you figure out a way using comprehensive input to increase your comprehension, understanding of the language. You did a lot of listening. And then you found out you would like to be better your speaking and proficiency. So that is
Hmm.
something. It's like there's a gap in there. So definitely, Dr. Steve Krashen, actually the comprehensible input is so powerful because that's why I also talk about kids. Well, if you think about first language learning, it's all about listening for the first
Hmm.
year, and then you produce the first word, and then you never go talk to the use the news, to talk to the little kids. You say something, surround them, something they can use every day. So when you talk about add a little bit more, be at your level, but challenge, give yourself a little bit of challenge. So things are
Hmm.
not too difficult, but make you curious enough and say, I can do this. Let me do more. So I think
Yeah.
that's the way we are talking about here. And then for speaking wise, that's a key challenge. And what did you do with the pronunciation and speaking? Because a lot of people just talk about speaking instead of they worry about their pronunciation, but they are not sure. And I know you actually have a very interesting newsletter. You have your newsletter name. I'm going to like to talk about it, and people can actually subscribe it, and they have a kind of a lesson, sent to them. So, would you like to talk about this your speaking proficiency method so people can learn from you?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I kind of discovered going back to what I was saying earlier about like I'd had a lot of input, my comprehension skills were getting better and better. But then I had a couple of experiences that made me realize that my speaking skills were not at the level that I thought they were. I'd kind of overestimated the extent to which improving my comprehension skills had also, as a byproduct, improved my speaking skills. Because you sometimes get this impression when you hear people talking online about comprehensible input that it's all you need to do when learning a language. That like really, like the better your comprehension skills get, the better your speaking will get just naturally without
Mhm.
having to do anything additional. And so
Mhm.
I kind of thought that was the case. Like I was speaking, like, and I was opening my mouth and Chinese words were coming out.
Mhm.
But then I had a couple of experiences where some native speakers who were kind of a little bit less polite than maybe the average in Chinese society, because Chinese people tend to be very polite towards foreigners who are learning their language. And I encountered a couple who were just not very polite. And they just kind of told it as it was. And they said, when you speak Chinese, like I can't understand what you're saying because the tones are all over the place and it's often causing communication barriers. And
Mhm.
initially I was a bit offended by this. I thought like like the problem, it was their problem. Like, but then I realized that, they're probably right because even the polite ones who are telling me my Chinese is awesome, half the time they don't seem to understand what I'm saying.
Mhm.
Or they've kind of, I was having a lot of communication barriers. And
Mhm.
so that's kind of what led me to down this rabbit hole of tones. and pronunciation, because I think previous to that, my attitude towards tones and Chinese pronunciation had been similar to most people's attitude when they learn a European language, if they already come from a European language. So like an English person learning Spanish or learning French, um, which is to say that like pronunciation is usually seen as more of a luxury.
Mhm.
So it's an optional add-on. So
Mhm.
you get the other stuff down, and then like as a luxury add-on, you can hone your pronunciation, but it's kind of not necessary because people will still be able to understand you if you have an English
Mhm.
accent speaking Spanish or French. Whereas what I gradually started to realize was that in Chinese, tones are not an optional add-on. They're kind of, really core to being able to be understood.
Mhm.
And that realization kind of sent me down this rabbit hole of trying to figure out, well, what should I do now? Because I've learned like a few thousand Mandarin words, but I'm not pronouncing them with the correct tones because I've not been paying enough attention to that dimension of the language. And so then I started kind of using a lot of the techniques that I've blogged about since then that I teach through my coaching and through the newsletter, the Tones Mechanic newsletter that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And these are basically like aimed at people who are like me. And this is probably a majority of in intermediate adult learners in Mandarin. They've reached a certain level, but they're not speaking with the correct tones. It's like, what do you do then? So there's a few different things to it because there's no one kind of thing that you can do to solve all these problems. So there's different parts to it. I mean, the first thing is that you need to train yourself to be able to hear the tones properly. You need to test whether you can do that, and get feedback externally to make sure that you're able to tell the differences between the tones. Because this is usually the first problem that a lot of people can't actually distinguish between the different tones when they're spoken clearly and in isolation or in tone pairs. And then once you're able to do that, then the next stage is obviously being able to say them out loud yourself correctly. And for this, like the most important thing is getting external feedback. You can't rely on your own internal ear for any of this because unless you've kind of received training previously or you come from a tonal background yourself, you it's likely that it's not a good idea to rely on your own judgment as to whether or not you're hearing things correctly or producing things correctly.
Mhm.
So in the initial stages, you need a lot of this constant feedback, correction, and that kind of thing, starting with, as I say, the individual tones, then moving on to tone pairs, and then moving on to sentences using different mimicking techniques,
Mhm.
all the while getting lots of external feedback. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I ended up doing and what I'm blogging about and teaching through my newsletter and coaching programs.
Right. And it's very interesting when you say the tones and then individual tones identification, and then you have to say it out loud and you cannot rely on yourself. You probably need some assistance from outside. This is very interesting because a lot of times I will also tell my students, not just adult students, they need to record themselves.
Hmm.
Can you understand yourself? When you record yourself reading one sentence or one expression or one short stories with a few sentences, if you don't understand, other people won't
Right,
be able to understand.
right.
So
Absolutely.
if that's the case, you definitely would like to talk to someone who can give you some kind of assistance to guide you through this whole thing. Um, so was it very challenging for you when you were talking about you try to correct the tones or the pronunciation? What kind of method did you use? Anything, you think can be helpful for the listeners?
Yeah, so first of all, like it was challenging, but then at the same time, it was probably less challenging than I expected based on what I'd heard from other people, because the message that people in the position I was in at that time tend to get from fluent Chinese speakers online is that if you leave it too late, then it's kind of impossible to correct later.
Mm,
And the best thing to do is to do it at the beginning, which I agree
mm,
with. The best thing to do is if you're starting out, like definitely learn tones from the beginning and use all the mimicking techniques and make sure that you get lots of feedback on them at the beginning.
right.
But like, yeah, just to answer the question whether it was challenging, it's challenging later on, but it's definitely not impossible. And you can improve if you kind of take it seriously with like, say you do like half an hour training a day, within weeks, months, you can make a lot of progress.
A big
It's not going to
progress.
take you the rest of your life to correct this problem that you have. So it's achievable within a reasonable time frame, but it takes some work and it requires consistency for sure. In terms of like the specific methods, so I think um, mimicking techniques, learning how to mimic properly and effectively is super important. So, as I mentioned before, you want to start with mimicking the individual tones. And there's a couple of mimicking techniques that I find particularly effective. So, one of them is called the echo method. And this
Hmm.
is a method developed by a mutual friend, Professor Karen Chung of National Taiwan University.
Yeah.
And the method basically consists in you listen to a Chinese word or sentence or phrase, and you listen to a native recording of it. And then instead of repeating it straight away, which is normally the mimicking technique that most people use to straight away launch into repeating it,
Hmm.
you pause for a second, you allow the audio to echo in your head. So everybody has this internal echo that we can make use of in this way. And then once you've kind of paused, allowed it to echo, then you repeat. But
Right.
you wait a few seconds for it to echo and then you repeat. And what we find is that we tend to be a lot more accurate when we pause, allow it to echo, and then mimic it in that way. So that's more effective, particularly at the earlier stages, and for something as challenging as tones, than just launching into the mimicking. So I used a lot of the those kind of mimicking techniques to mimic individual characters, just individual tones, moving on to tone pairs because most words consist in two characters
Hmm.
rather than one character. So
Hmm.
it makes sense to get used to the 20 different tone pair combinations and become comfortable producing each one. And then once you've done that, you can, if you're comfortable producing all of the 20 tone pairs and you've used mimicking techniques to become comfortable doing that and train yourself to do that, then you've basically in theory, mastered all of the different tone contours that there are to master in Chinese.
Hmm.
So at that point, the challenge then shifts to sort of whole sentences and being able to produce them at a more natural pace and continuing using mimicking techniques like the echo method to do that.
Yeah.
And I think
Well,
in the initial stages, the tone pairs is something that's really important. It's a very important stage to go through.
well, the way you talk about it's almost like a dance, step by step. Dance
Mm,
with the tones, dance with the characters with the tones. And it sounds a lot of fun. Actually, it is, right? Because tones are actually very important. I would say, well, the little kids will say like, 我要吃糖,
mm.
I want to eat candy. But if you say it a little bit off, then it will be 我要吃汤, and then you're going to get your soup. So
Right,
that's
right,
why it
right.
is so important. But what did you hear? Tang,
Mm.
candy, or tang, soup? I think that's what makes it so interesting. I do want to say this is actually does look like a dance. Actually, when you dance and when you say things, everything becomes easier because you're more
Mm.
relaxed, right? So this is the
Yeah,
one
yeah,
method I use actually. So let the kids dance or adults say, well, just stand up. Let's do a little bit move. And when they
right.
move, when you have the mind, the body all together with the pronunciation, suddenly it's not so serious.
Yeah, and it's good to have those kind of anchors. Like one thing I used to do a lot was use hand movements, like this one for the first tone and then a
Ah,
rising one, and or head movements. And in like the issue with this is that you if you do it for too long, then you find it difficult once you even when you're fluent, you end up like doing this with your hand, that kind of thing.
yeah, let's do a
But I think in
symphony.
the in the initial stages, it's very useful to like
Yes.
to kind of anchor it to something else that's physical.
Mhm.
And that definitely helped me.
That's great. So I think now we understand why your newsletter is called Tones Mechanic. So
Mm, yeah.
actually, you're really into that, almost like thinking like a scientist, an engineer, step by step. And I'll just say it's like a dance. So dance with some Mischa, and then and learn the tones and the correct pronunciation. That just sounds beautiful. And
And the mechanic thing is also like it has connotations with fixing because
yes.
as I say, like the people that I'm really targeting here are the people who have learned Chinese for a while, got to a certain level. Like I say, this is most learners learn kind of an atonal Chinese or semi-atonal Chinese, only really like half learned the tones, but not really paid full attention to them. And now it requires a process of kind of going in and figuring out exactly what your problems are and fixing them in the way that a mechanic would fix a car.
Right. And I think the most important thing you talk about fixing, and then you at the beginning you also talk about a lot of people talk about, oh, you should learn it correctly, accurately at the beginning. Well, a lot of time we talk about that. Oh, kids should learn a language earlier. If you're learning a language, you should learn all this earlier. But I think you you brought something very important here is like, it's okay if there's a little bit imperfection here, we
Mm.
can fix it, just like you said. It's a little bit challenging because you need to unlearn something you have learned wrong. So we definitely would like you to learn accurately at the beginning. But if there's a little situation, we can fix it. And I do think, the mimicking, the echo method, the things you were talking about definitely can be very powerful, especially not just for young learners, but also for adult learners. And that is true. I
Right.
have also seen that in my coaching and in my training to adult learners. So I think that is definitely very important. I don't forget to go to I'm Learning Chinese website and subscribe to Mischa's newsletter, Tones Mechanic. So because you had the several trips to China and also twice in Taiwan, so I want to check in with you, like how important is understanding Chinese culture in the process of learning the language? Can you share some insights with that? It can be
Mm.
confusing, and it happens a
Yeah,
lot.
like to on the cultural issue, I think it's like very important to understand the culture, but very difficult at the start. You naturally start to understand things about the culture more the more you progress in your language abilities because you start to pick up on what's going on around you in a way that you didn't before. And
Mm-hmm.
I think this ties into the learning process quite a lot because a podcast episode that I recorded, for example, with a couple of Chinese friends on this topic was about like Chinese politeness and the culture of Chinese politeness and how this affects learners in different
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
So in this podcast episode, we were talking about how, well, I was sharing my experiences up until then of learning Chinese and how, like, how polite all of the Chinese people, or most of them I'd encountered, were when talking about my Chinese and telling me how amazing my Chinese was. And I think a lot of Chinese learners, they struggle in the initial stages to understand um, how much this has to do with Chinese culture, like people telling you how amazing your Chinese is and seeming really sincere when they say it.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of people who are coming from a Western background and are exposed to that, they start believing it because they're not
Mm-hmm.
aware of what that is, which is just purely encouragement to so that you can keep on studying and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
Paradoxically, one of the things that I found, which was also touched on in that podcast episode, was that the better your Chinese level gets, and the more you're able to establish like real friendships and connections in that language,
Mm-hmm.
the the more you start to tap into a different side of Chinese culture, which is that when people feel close to you, when they feel like they're a good friend, their idea of how a good friend should behave is very different from what we're used to. So what we're used to is that when, say, we have like something that we want to achieve, like we're trying to reach a high Chinese level or something like that. Or like in my case, I remember I started my blog and that was something I wanted to build. So when I told my friends from the UK about this, their kind of idea of how they should be a good friend is to just basically support me and say, "Oh, that's such a good idea," or like, I think you're going to smash it, like it's going to be amazing," and all this kind of stuff. And when I told my Chinese friends, the reaction was totally different. Their idea of what it meant to be a good friend is to kind of not get my hopes up and sort of be more realistic. And so they
Mm-hmm.
would say things like, why are you doing a blog? Like people don't read blogs anymore. And have you thought maybe you could do a YouTube channel instead? People like prefer YouTube and Instagram now, like the more visual side of things. And so there was this, like I really wasn't expecting that. And initially I kind of took that in an like I was a little bit offended. It's sort of like as a good friend, you should be supporting me. And but anyway, as I progressed more, kind of I got more used to those things. And but it's very interesting how the cultural element plays out and affects our language learning process, I think.
Yes. And then I think it's so interesting. It's actually also universal in a way. In any language, when you hit certain level, the proficiency is high enough to have the real connection in the language. When you use a very good what you say when you're really good friends and they really want to help you, they will tell you what they really think. And in Chinese, they words from the heart, 真心
Mm.
话. Right?
Yeah.
It's
Right, right.
two hard words, and which means I'm going to tell you what I think. And it's
Mm.
very common that people can feel offended. But the idea is if you reflect on that, say, well, maybe this makes sense. Let me think about it.
Mm. I
And
think there's
Misha,
different as yeah, there's different aspects to this. I think one of the things that we're not used to when we're on the receiving end of this kind of realism is that like it's in like British culture, in like Western culture, like there's a different attitude towards like taking risks, particularly when it's to do with your life and career and that kind of thing. And
hmm.
so if you tell like friends that you hate your job and you want to kind of pursue your passions, everyone's going to be like, go for it. Like it'll be amazing and you'll succeed and all this kind of thing. But I think the in Chinese culture, the attitude towards these taking risks, particularly when it comes to the fundamentals of your life in that way, is tends to be discouraged a lot more. And so if you're not expecting that or used to that, you can the way that you might take it is that this person's just trying to put you down, like
Mm.
in Chinese, like 打压你, like
Yes, it's a good one.
yeah.
Die is like a
So
hit, yeah is like a press. Don't do that.
right, right. Yeah, so that's what it can feel like sometimes when you're not used to it.
Oh, think about this. Think about Chinese kids talking to their parents. They want to change certain things. That's exactly what would happen. So isn't it beautiful about the cultural differences and
Hmm.
how similar they can be, or how different they can be? And I think that's also the magic of learning a language. And we're sitting here having this conversation. We're laughing about this, but I believe when both of us were encountering, this kind of situation, we're like, huh? We really need to think hard in my brain
Yeah.
and in your brain,
Right, right.
right? So this is a fabulous discussion. I think that's so interesting. And so well, now I want to talk about because this whole learning process it really inspired you in so many different ways. The learning method you talk about, the resolution you have found the solutions that listeners can benefit from. You have a program called a Mandarin Retreat. It sounds so fun. It's like a summer camp. It can be a winter camp
Hmm.
as well. So can you talk about that? How can people, be a part of this? And what are you doing there?
Yeah, so the Mandarin Retreat, this idea kind of first started when we were just coming out of lockdown, and I'd been learning Mandarin in the UK in all that time. And so one of the issues that me and the rest of the other people I knew who were also learning Mandarin in the UK, friends I had here, who were also Mandarin learners, one of the recurring problems that we had was the lack of this kind of immersive Mandarin speaking environment.
Mhm.
And so I was thinking about how I could solve this issue more for myself in the initial stages and for my friends. And so what we came up with was this idea that we'd all spend a weekend away. We'd like rent a house and basically just spend the entire weekend speaking only Chinese. And we'd
Mhm.
invite some Chinese friends to come with us, and we'd all do cooking together and play games together and go hiking together. And just the only rule was no English, all in Chinese. And we
Mhm.
were all kind of at an intermediate level, lower intermediate. Maybe a couple of friends were higher elementary, but we all felt we were at a stage where we could benefit from this. And so we kind of went for it and had a lot of fun that whole weekend and felt like in that weekend we like I personally felt like I'd learned more Mandarin than I had in weeks previously, maybe even months of
Mhm.
learning Mandarin from studying in my bedroom during lockdown kind of thing. It was this having being surrounded by the language and actually doing things in the language, the vocabulary sticks in a much more efficient way than it would otherwise. And so there's nothing quite like tying uh, the language to actual real experiences and connections with friends. And so after the success of that kind of trip and how much it benefited my Mandarin, I started thinking about how could I branch out to offer this to other learners out there who are interested in
Mhm.
something similar. And I mean, so what I did then was that was the genesis of Mandarin Retreat. So we started hosting these immersive weekend camps, and we opened it up for other Mandarin learners, and they were much more popular than I expected them to be. And so ever since then, we've grown. Initially, we started doing summer camps, which were a bit longer, and now we're doing our next one is going to be in August of this year, and it's going to be 2 weeks long. And what we do is we balance them out so that we try and have a perfect balance of learners to native speakers so that people who are on the retreats are constantly surrounded by native native kind of Mandarin. And we do a variety of activities. We all go hiking together. We have classes in kind of dumpling making, in playing Chinese board games, all kinds of different activities and doing them together. And yeah, so that's basically been running now for a couple of years.
Mhm.
And like I say, the next one's in August. It's going to be held in Somerset
Yeah.
in the UK. Unfortunately, if anybody's listening to this and they're really interested in coming to the summer one, it is fully booked. But if you want to be
Yeah.
on the waiting list,
Please be on the
uh,
waiting list for the next one.
you can go to imlearningmandarin.com, and the Mandarin Retreat summer camp page is up on there, and you can provide maybe a link to it in the description as well. But
Sure, I will.
you can sign up for the waiting list. But we are planning on holding m many more of these events in 2026. So stay tuned for that.
Yes. So, well, I think it's a living in the language, living in the culture together with friends and total immersion, but not the school textbook kind of way. It's a living
Right,
the language way. It's have fun the way, play along with the language and how go
right.
out and about in the language in Mandarin Chinese. That's just beautiful. I think it's a fun and impactful place to go and a period of time to enjoy, to meet other friends and who are
Mm.
also interested in learning Mandarin Chinese. All right.
Absolutely. And we have people from all over Europe because there's nothing really similar to these kind of camps in the rest of Europe. So we've had people flying in from France, Italy, Germany, other European countries. And so it's a real international mix. But one of the main differences between this and classroom learning is, as you say, it's not classroom based. It's we do have like daily kind of conversational, structured conversational, more
Mhm.
classroom based activities, but that's most of it is actually just spent doing activities together and learning through doing activities. So it's led by professional teachers.
Mhm.
And the main difference between this and similar kind of immersion opportunities is that you're constantly surrounded by the native speakers. So there are other kind of when you're in the classroom, one of the things I found that I didn't like as much was unless it's one to one,
Mm.
you're often surrounded by the majority of people in that classroom other than you. There may be one teacher, but the majority of people are other learners at maybe not that higher level. And so
Mhm.
so what you're doing there is you're surrounding yourself with kind of a foreign form of the language, like an intermediate, lower intermediate, whatever version of Chinese, which is not the same as what you really want to expose yourself to, which is like at least in my case, like was always native speakers of the language. That's what I wanted to learn and mimic. And so yeah, this is something that we provide through these retreats and this kind of immersive opportunity for people who otherwise wouldn't have it.
Absolutely. Well, that's always what I say. Let's make learning fun. And I think this is definitely a playful way to learn, but seriously way to advance. That's always very important. So, all right. So here's the challenge for you. So can you recommend three fun Chinese resources for our listeners or viewers who are, looking to immerse themselves in the language and the Chinese language and the Chinese culture? Here you go.
Absolutely. So my first two resources are going to be more on the side of comprehensible input, that term that I brought up earlier, Stephen Krashen's term. So opportunities for like intermediate learners, things I found really useful at an intermediate level to immerse myself in the language when I didn't have a huge Mandarin vocabulary and wasn't high enough level to be able to watch TV or understand, native level podcasts and that kind of thing. So the first one is Mandarin Companion, which is a series of graded readers, which I think I completed all of the series. They start from around I think 150 characters. So once
Yes.
you know your first 150 characters,
Mhm.
you can start immersing yourself in these stories. And some of the stories are taken from their like sort of uh sort of Chinese versions written in simple Chinese versions of sort of famous stories um that you probably already know. So that kind of helps with the comprehension side of things. And it starts from about 150. It goes on to about over 1,000 characters, I
Mhm.
think. So that's really, really useful when you're trying to build your reading skills up and character recognition level at kind of a higher elementary lower intermediate level and bridging the gap to more native content. Once you've kind of like maybe got to a point where the graded readers are like you've maybe read most of them and you want to like bridge the gap to the next level, the second resource that I'm going to recommend, which I found super useful for that, is LinkU. So LinkU is an app and a website which is founded and run by the polyglot Steve Kaufman. And and basically, this app it facilitates the reading and listening process. It has a massive library of content on there for learners at different levels, and I think it's particularly useful. Its content is particularly useful for intermediate learners in Chinese. So it has a series of podcasts and other different types of content on there that you can basically read and listen to, and it will keep a track of your statistics, the number of words that you know, the number of words that you've read and how your vocabulary is growing over time. So it has a whole system in there to do that. And it also allows you to import content that you from any website online. So if you want to read like an article from the BBC News website in China, like BBC Chinese or something like that, you can actually just import it into the LinkU
Mhm.
system. If you want to, if like you have a YouTube video in Chinese that has subtitles, then you can also import that into LinkU and study it there and keep a track of your progress on that app. So I recommend LinkU. It takes a little bit of getting used to. It's not quite the sort of user interface is not as smooth as some of the more slicker apps, but actually, unfortunately, one of the paradoxes is that often with Chinese learning apps, what I find is the slicker the user interface, the worse, the less efficient the app, and the better the user interface, um, the less efficient the actual learning on the app is. And I'm not going to mention any apps in particular except for Duolingo, maybe because I wrote an article about that problem, which you can read on my website. The
Yeah.
third resource that I'm going to mention is Tandem, which is an app that facilitates language exchange. So this is now moving into the other problem that I was mentioning, which is um, getting better at speaking Mandarin.
Mm.
So Tandem basically facilitates matching you with a language exchange partner, and there are many kind of Chinese people on there who are really looking to improve their English or meet people who are learning Chinese. Some of them are very helpful, and this app, particularly during the lockdown and afterwards, really helped me in my Mandarin learning. So
Mhm.
I was able to connect with um, Chinese speakers on a daily basis and exchange text messages, and then set aside some time to do language exchange with them. And so that's a really useful app as well. So those are my three resources.
Fabulous. I mean, here you go. And then we'll have everything in the show note and also in the description. So thank you so much, Misha. And so with such valuable resources. But most importantly, we want to know where people can find you and then your social media or things you would like to have people to connect you with. I think they will be eager to connect with you and then learn more from your method and also the retreat.
Yeah, so if you can find me on imlearningmandarin.com, so that's where I post regular blogs and podcasts, and they can all be found on imlearningmandarin.com. And I also run the I'm Learning Mandarin community on Discord, so you can find that through imlearningmandarin.com. In the menu, there's you can basically click onto the Discord and join that. And join that. It's an open community for Mandarin learners. And basically, we support each other to improve our speaking skills in particular and pronunciation. So those are probably the two best ways to find me.
Fabulous. So thank you so much, Misha, for coming to Playful Chinese. And I'm so happy we had this chance to talk about all the important ways to learn Mandarin and then the challenges and then solution. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.